Can we reimagine the systems we live in? How can economics reflect our common humanity? And can we change it in time?
Welcome back to Real Time with Steve and friends. This week we've got Alex Howlett. We're going to be talking about universal basic income. It's going to be a whole lot of fun. Be kind, stay safe, and enjoy the show.
Welcome back to Real Time with Steve Ken and friends. Today's guest is Alex Howlett from the Gresham Institute in Boston, and he's here with a refreshing take on how we may be over-incentivizing work in the modern economy. Can a UBI, or more specifically, a calibrated UBI, help us eliminate economic activities that are wasteful and unnecessarily coercive? Now, when I first came across UBI through David Graeber, then Rutger Bregman, then Scott Santens, my first, second, and third instinct was I would like it to be a credible answer to the big problem of workism and exploitation generally. We're losing so much talent to economic churn. It seemed like a good market signal for figuring out what work actually needed doing. But I feared it was an economic version of trying to pull yourself up in the air by your shoelaces. But this was before MMT, and I was thinking in terms of taxpayer money and not resources, which doesn't solve things automatically, but it does make the problem very different. Then MMTers seemed to be getting in a big tiz about UBI, which was confusing. So I went down another rabbit hole and read Pavlina's The Case for a Job Guarantee, and I still couldn't see why UBI and a job guarantee were mutually exclusive. For instance, one might reduce the working week by a day or more, and the other could enhance working conditions for everyone and make more income above a UBI for anyone that wanted it. Full transparency, I'm personally in favor of finding out what happens if you introduce a version of both a UBI and a job guarantee. Not just because I'm a centrist dad, but because they both solve different problems. So if you're a UBI advocate, welcome. But also a special welcome for the MMTers who are listening in with teacups rattling with rage already, or fingers poised over the keyboard ready to repeat the talking points against UBI. What about a job guarantee? Or tax credits that aren't used to provision the government are inflationary? Or all you're doing is resetting the prices upwards by the value of the UBI? We know all the talking points. This show is MMT sympathetic, but we're not here to simply repeat Kelton or Mosler talking points for you. We're here to test and investigate all economic ideas from a systems point of view. We like to get under the hood and into the weeds. I've kind of mixed the metaphor there. Suddenly we're in an underwater car, but whatever. The point is, systems are complex. They do not always respond in the way a theoretical model might suggest. And that's why we've got Ty here as well with this national model. He's done some modeling on what happens at the macro level if you introduce a UBI. Also, what happens if you introduce a federal job guarantee. So hang in there. Different worldviews will be on display, but go with it. Alex has researched and thought deeply about this area in terms of the mechanics and the incentives of a UBI. And also this, as much as anyone with half a heart believes the poorest should get economic support from a purely ethical standpoint, it should happen anyway. So on its own, I don't think that's a compelling argument for a UBI. So take that as given. What gets more political traction from a what's in it for me from the larger electorate is that there's a far larger number of people who may not be on the breadline, but would contribute differently if they were not quite as snarled up with work they have zero interest in, but are doing it because they have to. Finding the level at which that starts to happen is exactly what Alex's approach of a calibrated UBI is all about. Also, and this is something that really needs to be taken more seriously, a combined platform with both policies will have a lot more clout politically. Just saying. Ticks a lot more boxes for voters if both are on there. Anyway, enough from me with the scene setting. Let's get Alex in here and let's start finding out how this all goes together. Here he is, Alex Howlett. Welcome to Steve Keen and Friends. I should say welcome back, because I've chatted with you before, but you haven't been on Steve Keen and Friends. So it's really good to have you. How you been?
I've been good. It's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolute pleasure. What is all this about work being coercive in the current economy? Let's talk about that to start with before I get the rest of the team on, because that seems to be the most obvious point to come in, I think, from your point of view. You can correct me if I'm wrong. We can talk in a minute about how you got into all this, but I think that's the most provocative idea that I've heard about why UBI is perhaps a solution. Is that a good place to start? Can we do that?
Sure. Well, paid labor is always coercive, not just in today's environment. It's by nature coercive because you're paying someone to do something different from what they otherwise would have wanted to do. So that's coercion.
Simple as that, really. But how can and is it okay to talk about a calibrated approach first? Because that is different from any other advocate for UBI that I've heard of. Perhaps why a calibrated UBI is maybe a bit different from what people are thinking a UBI is.
Sure. Well, you need a certain amount of coercion in the economy because there's work that needs doing, right? So you need to provide an incentive for people to work. So that comes in the form of wages, and there are also social incentives, and there's plenty of work that's incentivized that's not paid. It comes from other incentives, but you essentially want the incentives to be balanced such that people are spending their time, optimally doing stuff that's useful and beneficial and fulfilling and that kind of thing. If you set up your economy so that everybody has to get their money from jobs, then you're creating a situation where you have to create jobs in order to give people money. And I would argue that that's what we do today with full employment policy. So ideally what we would want is an economy and a society where work is neither over-incentivized nor under-incentivized. So there's useful work that we're paying for, and then we don't want to overpay for work beyond the point where it's useful, because then people actually become less productive and less happy.
Let's get some of the rest of the team in here. Steve, if we get Steve to come on down. Welcome.
Gosh, how are you?
Steve, nice to see you again.
Mm-hmm.
And Steve, what's your take on a UBI? I think for anybody that's unfamiliar, perhaps we don't talk about UBI a lot, but just maybe a stance that you've had, and perhaps just a quick roundup of where it maybe fits in your worldview with a job guarantee as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's one essential reason that I want to have a UBI, and that's to give economists pay to sell them they no longer teach economics. That'd be a fabulous improvement in the value of society. Get rid of pay economists not to teach, which is what I'm doing with the UBI. They're the one group I wouldn't care if they don't do anything. So
do you think that would turn up in the modelling? The number of economists would go down as the UBI went up. That'd be quite good.
Yeah. So there are some jobs you don't want to have done, And I mean, being slightly facetious with economics, but I really can't think of anything else they're useful for apart from teaching neoclassical economics. That's a negative rather than a positive. So I'd rather be able to offer them the UBI and get them out of the system and give them time to work out something else to do. But like, I'm being a bit facetious to start this show, but that's, hey, it's a Saturday. Partly my own experience of being unemployed at various times when I was also trying to establish something rather innovative. So I was trying to run a set of seminars on Southeast Asian journalists, media coverage of Australia, and vice versa. And I resigned from the organisation I was employed for beforehand because they wouldn't put the idea forward. So I ended up doing it on the dole. And I finally got the funding to enable it to happen, less than I needed to do it successfully. So that particular set of conferences was a failure, whereas I had an outrageous success with one in China about a year or two before that. But by the time I finally got the funding to enable me to start the project, I was down to $4 in my bank account. And what I was doing effectively was trying to start something new. Now, if the dole made that possible, but of course the pay was below subsistence ultimately. That's why I ended up with $4 in my account. This is back in 1980, by the way. So it's a long time ago, or 1979, 1980, 82, about that period of time. But I understand the view that I think Alex would have as well, that UBI isn't paying people to do nothing, it's paying to do anything. And that's the creative side of it that I like, that there are plenty of people who are working for a wage right now who might want to start something else, but they can't afford to work on that something else while they're being paid a wage. They don't have time in one case, and if they don't have the finances, if they leave it out. So that's the particular side of UBI that I prefer. Apparently Dave's on my communication. Okay. Yeah, so I would like something which gave people the possibility that like a three-tiered approach. You get the UBI, which would replace unemployment benefits and be higher, enough to survive on, but not a lot more than that. Job guarantee, paying more, but you're required to do particular work, and that may or may not be in your skill set. And then private employment or employment with the state, where you get a higher pay as well. So I've never understood the level of conflict that occurs in the American conversation over UBI, or how MMT reacts to it, which I find it remarkably antagonistic. And the arguments they give in favour of your job guarantee and against UBI tend to treat UBI as a right-wing idea to reduce payments to poor people, from what I can tell. And I'm just puzzled. A lot of my attempt to understand why MMT in particular is so hostile to a UBI is that it possibly reflects the dreadful state of American social security, which is probably better called social insecurity. And the picture people have is that UBI would be a way of reducing what gets paid in terms of overall social services. And I think that's reflecting the pathetic state of American political economy versus Europe, and to some extent the Antipodean societies, and also some Asian. Not Asian don't have enough of both unemployment or social security in general, but the American experience seems particularly bad, and that seems to be why there's such hostility from MMT people towards UBI.
Yeah, it doesn't seem borne out in the modeling. Sorry, Alex, go ahead.
I can understand MMT's antagonism towards UBI and their hostility, and I think it comes from kind of, if you're looking at the world through an MMT lens, you believe that money is fundamentally a tax credit, right? You believe that taxes drive the currency, so the government spends money into the economy and says, oh, now you have to pay the taxes, and then the third thing that kind of drives it is that the government offers jobs. So the whole point of money and spending money into the economy and taxing it back is so that the government can provision itself. So the value of money comes from what it's used to buy, and the government is buying labor with that money, and that's what that's the whole money story, the ontology of money from an MMT perspective. If the government is spending money into the economy and buying nothing, then you've undermined the integrity of money, right? It goes against kind of this core fundamental MMT thing. Now, I think MMT is wrong about kind of their fundamental understanding of the nature of money, but you can understand why they're hostile towards
Yeah,
UBI.
I think that's true. I mean, because they think it's a tax credit, so if you're not being taxed,
Yeah.
you're not being required to work in that sense. Whereas I come from more of a circuitous. That was my original approach coming out of Minsky and the circuit school from circuitous school from Europe. And their attitude is that money is, you know, if a promise, a third party promise that is accepted by buyer and seller in the payment of commercial obligations. And that sort of says, well, you know, even in that situation, if it's government fiat money is being created as well, it's used in commerce. So it's not just that it's taxed back that gets people to work. It's an essential part of commercial exchange, and that isn't damaged by having some people being paid income from government money creation without requiring them to do work in return.
And Alex, you've got an approach in which you'd pretty much stand against the idea or the concept of a full employment, which seems to go with a job guarantee. And yet, you know, Steve's there talking about a blended view. What's your thoughts on that? Because full employment doesn't, or at least a job guarantee, to my mind, because it's voluntary, doesn't automatically mean a, you know, full employment. We must have everybody in a job, sort of thing. So I wondered if you've thought about that that complexity and just respond to Steve's ideas of blending them, or blending some aspects of them all.
Yeah, so I'm gonna say I'm not a blender. I think a job guarantee is always and everywhere a bad idea, and it's not. I mean, I know people like to frame it as voluntary, like you don't have to take the job guarantee job if you don't want. But you could say the same thing about today's economy, like, oh, you don't have to get a job if you don't want. You can, you know, starve in a gutter or something like that. Okay, that's not really voluntary. So the question is, you know, if people want jobs, you know, it's because they want the money that the job pays, right? Generally speaking, right? So in order to have a job guarantee, you need to be able to have that capacity to give people money, right? The economy has to have the capacity to absorb that spending from those consumers who are receiving that wage through the job guarantee wage. So that necessarily means the level of UBI that your economy can sustain has to be lower. Right. So essentially what you're doing, this is kind of a simplified version, but a job guarantee implies that you're withholding money in order to get them to go work, right? To go get their money through jobs. And if you weren't withholding any money, then you couldn't afford to do a job guarantee anyway. Right. So that's the contradiction there, or that's kind of the tension between the job guarantee and the UBI, is that you know, are you withholding money from people to force them to go work? And there are degrees of this, right? Like freedom is a continuum, and voluntary, you know, how voluntary it is a continuum. And the more you expect people to get their money through jobs, the less voluntary it is, and the more coercive it is. And that's fine. You need some of that, but you should be paying people for work you want done, not saying, oh, we want people to have jobs, let's come up with jobs for people.
Let's get Ty and Mike on as well, mainly so that we can do top chatters, to be honest with you. Here he is. Here they both are. We've got Braces Mike, and we've got non-Elvis Ty, which I really wanted.
Non-Elvis?
Yeah. It looks so clean and bright.
Coif.
Yeah. I missed that. But anyway, welcome, guys. You've been listening in. I think we started off by talking about blended idea. You know, Alex has rejected that. It's one or the other sort of thing, or it's, you know, UBI in his case. And I just wanted to see if you had any thoughts on whether or not these systems are reconcilable in any way. Steve thinks they are. Mike or Ty, don't mind.
Yeah, you know, I haven't. So there's definitely, you know, the blended opinion. I like, this is a new term for me, blended policies.
Yeah. For want of a better term.
Blended policy. Yeah, there's blended policies everywhere in the economy. The way I look at, so there's the D.T. Cochrane view where he calls it the triad, right? And especially like Steve was mentioning in the American system with such a bad, you know, social security system, the big conflict there is basic services, right? So from the MMT perspective, maybe the layman perspective, the fear is that a UBI would squash any basic services. Now, that perspective, let's say in a country like mine, Canada, doesn't really exist. We already have pretty solid basic services out there. So we would just be nuancing all that with some basic income. So there's that view of blending it. There's the view, like Alex was saying, right, that the pitfalls of a job guarantee versus a UBI, right? And there are, every policy has its goods, its good parts and its bad parts, right? There's no silver bullet. My opinion, now I've modeled it all, so I have some basic results, but my intuition behind it all is ultimately, if we can get let's look at the American situation. If we can get any of those progressive policies, just one of them through, let's push it, right? There's no point in fighting, amongst progressives. If you want to make the world a better place, just, go for something that's going to be politically feasible. And from that perspective, the most politically feasible option in the United States would probably be a UBI. One, because the administration of it isn't very capital intensive. And that's a big selling point to a free market America, right? So essentially, you're just cutting checks to people, right? So that's probably why I've always kind of been a leaner to the UBI over other programs for Americans. Now, if I was in a more socialist country, I'd say, okay, well, let's focus on those basic services first. Whether it's improving your healthcare, because Canada could use a more improved healthcare system, right? There's lots of social services up here that could use improvement before a UBI. But down in the States, there's 50% of the population is against government programs like that, big institutions, right? So the UBI is just a cash check. And let's face it, Americans are consumers, right? That's part of their ideology. So that's why I see it as a feasible selling point. And yeah, another issue too, I agree with Alex too, is the whole George Knapp MMT, currency value stuff. I think that's a bit simplified. There's truths to it. Tax credits are part of a demand for a currency, but you're doing the same thing when you inject UBI cash into it. The government is buying something. They're just buying it for the consumer to go consume, right? It's the same thing, right? So when you back out and you just look at a very macro level, they're exactly the same thing. The government is injecting financial assets into the private sector to stimulate the private sector. And there's risks from both systems, really, with inflationary pressures. If a nation can't import what it's not producing and that extra money goes into the economy, there is obviously an inflationary risk. And that is also applied to a job guarantee. You have to remember, a job guarantee, there's a lot of great ideas for jobs, taking care of old people, et cetera, socially good things, but they don't actually produce anything, right? So the risk exists there just as much as a UBI, whereas a UBI allows a person to pursue the things they really want to pursue, right? Which could lead to feasible production that the economy would want to consume. So those are kind of my basic ideas around a UBI or job guarantee. And for one, if the day came tomorrow, I don't care what country I live in, if it's a new groundbreaking basic service or a UBI or job guarantee, I'd be right there at the picket line saying, let's do it. I wouldn't care which of the three it would be, because it would be better than it is now.
Mike, your thoughts, just on the introduction, what comes to mind talking about whether these can be blended or whether that's desirable?
Right. Yeah. Hi to everybody. Several thoughts. I think, first of all, in the United States, I think a lot of people even on the right are not ogres. I think the phrase you hear a lot is that they would like a social safety net, but it's a safety net, not a hammock. You hear that a lot. So I think any of these policy proposals, if they were seen as a safety net and not something else, might have a chance of passing. I do think everybody has a lot of mental models about how these various programs might work, and we really need to model them formally with dynamic models to see over time how these things unfold. You know, a UBI is a flow policy. A ELR program is a stock policy. Stocks and flows change over time, dynamics. So they're different, right? And their dynamics are going to be different. And then we get, okay, so we have tools like, let's say, Minsky, for example, and we have people like, let's say, Ty, who produce models using this tool. Hooray. But you get into the Lucas critique and the dynamic versus static scoring issue from the Congressional Budget Office in the US. And that is, how do we know how people will react to policy changes, right? And the Congressional Budget Office says, we get it. You know, if the static approach says if you raise the tax rate, income tax or whatever, you'll get more tax revenue. And the dynamic scoring folks say, well, but people are going to change their behavior in response to that, so you can't say that. And then this static scoring people say, yeah, but we don't know how they're going to change their behavior, so to be safe, we'll go with static scoring. And that's kind of the Lucas critique kind of thing. So, so yes, we should model it, but we don't know. We'd just be guessing about how people are going to change their behavior. You know, we need pilot studies and what have you, I suppose, to start to get a handle on that. I'm not sure that maybe surveys, but really sort of observe people and see what how they're going to react to these things. And, you know, you get long run and short run trade-offs too when you do dynamic modeling. So if you shove the system in the direction you want, in the short run, you'll often get what you want, but then the system corrects. It adapts. There's negative feedback loops and it goes back to where it was or even makes it worse. Or going the other way, you shove the system counterintuitively in the direction you don't want, and in the short run, it goes where you don't want, but in the longer run, it adapts and goes the way that you wish. So, you know, to say, are you for it or you're against it, you know, it's very hard to say. Final point. And I think the employer of last resort folks have found this. You have built a mathematical model, and it has, you know, a buffer stock program with jobs and all this stuff, and wonderful things happen when the simulations unfold. Now try and pull that on. Okay, in the real world, what does that all mean? And it's not as easy as you know, mathematical modeling. So we need mathematical modeling, but then taking it from there to the real world, I think, is tricky business.
Well, we better say thank you to all our chatters. So I don't know if we've got a chatters board that we can bring up. But I think, Ty, I think it's time for you to do this. Geez. I think I've let you off at least a couple of weeks.
Oh, geez. And, you know, I added a bunch of new names, right? So I didn't quite expect this, but we'll go with it. Sherry Wise, The Hasty Ant, Kevin Mays, Larry Summers, the great Larry. Michael D'Souza Cruz, I can see in the chat going off right now. That's entertaining. Ghost on the Half Shell, Douglas Duell, JD, Phil Waller, TR, Bill Sticker, Dregai, Tony Wilson, Julius, Garen Osborne, TSG, G Med 7, maybe. Reagan. Okay, well, Reagan Boychuk, hello Reagan, Phil S, Norwich Guitar, I wonder if that's a real last name, Web Freaks, Noel, Charles O'Hare, Algorithm, Economics in One Lesson, Danger Zone, Nicholas Gomez, Turquoise Sound, Horatio 1886, have Tequila, Bob Dones, Lone Shark 88, The Herald of Change, Shot, Sata, Sarama, maybe, Good Times, Kathleen Logan Smith, Andrew Sullivan, Lana Dell, Joe Polito, Paul Trainer, Raccoon Graves, James Hansen, The Talk Watcher, Thomas Darlington, Hoops, Kevinski.
Hey,
pretty good.
Thank you very much.
Yes, so Ganymede is a moon of Jupiter, I think. You've got to look up your astronomy charts a bit more carefully.
Yeah, I didn't want to interrupt. I like to see him struggling. I thought it was good. So thank you very much. Alex, I'd like to I'd like to look at some sort of mechanics of, because of the research you've done, I want to see how much, maybe it's surprising to people who think they know how UBI should be rolled out, that kind of thing. So what's your approach to the mechanics? Let's not worry about the controversy anymore about, let's say we could introduce it tomorrow. Let's talk about how you think it would come into the economy and what the effects might be, including, let's talk about ZERP, and let's talk about, all the false incentives that you think are there. What's your way to
okay,
into that?
I can get to all of that, but first, what I want to do is I want to ask everybody a question. I want to kind of reset the conversation. And before I do that, I want to, we've been talking about UBI. I want to define what UBI is. Like, what is this thing that we're talking about? So it's a regular payment of free money to everyone on an ongoing basis. It doesn't have to be any particular amount of money. It could be 1 cent a year. It could be $1 million a day. But the mechanism is that it's the same amount of money to everyone on an ongoing basis. And then the question I want to ask is, it's a question I was asking people this summer. I went to Bath, England, to the Basic Income Earth Network Congress. And a question I asked everyone there, and these are by and large basic income UBI supporters, is what is the problem that UBI solves? And I got completely different answers from everyone. And from what I'm seeing in the chat and from what I've heard in our discussion so far, I'm seeing some of the same kinds of diversity of thought on universal basic income. So the question and by the way, sometimes I use the terms basic income and universal basic income interchangeably. It used to be called basic income. Now it's called universal basic income. Some people still call it basic income, but the MMT crowd has kind of started using basic income to mean something that's not universal, even though the universality used to be implied by the basic income. Anyway, I'm going to try to stick to UBI, but if basic income slips out of my mouth, I just mean UBI by that. So I want to ask each of you what is the problem that universal basic income solves? Like the main fundamental problem. And if you don't think it solves a problem, maybe what is the problem you think UBI supporters want it to solve? What problem is it intended to solve? What problem do you think I think it solves?
Go ahead, Steve.
Okay, well, look, my thinking about UBI is pretty coloured by my own experience of being unemployed on a couple of occasions when I was trying to start a business at the same time. And so I'm not going to be somebody in the UBI sits back on his ass watching TV. It enables me to, start something which I couldn't start otherwise because I couldn't afford not to be looking for a job without a UBI, something of that substantial level. I tend to think about it as something, I know universal means everybody gets it, including Rupert Murdoch, okay? And that's one of the issues you need to model in terms of what impact does that have upon what can be offered by the government otherwise just to run a deficit. It'd be a curious issue if you gave everybody a livable amount of money as a UBI, then what would that do to the level of money creation by the government, and how much room did it use for all the other activities the government does? So my thinking about it tends to be like it's a switch. Okay, if you're employed, and if you retire, you get sacked or you resign, you have two options. One is to go to a job guarantee, and the other is a basic income. The job guarantee obviously paying a higher amount than the basic income. So my thinking really probably isn't the U side of UBI. I am concerned about, and I'd want to do some of my modelling and Ty's modelling on this impact. If you wanted to give everybody a sufficient universal basic income that they could stay alive, and pay all their various rent costs, food costs, etc., what would be the potential? And yes, Brady's saying it causes inflation here. That's quite feasible. It could also potentially, in a realistic sense, crowd out other government expenditure, because if UBI was, I'm thinking in terms of the what I'm used to in my Australian past. I've lived in too many countries to have a decent base to say what that would be, but the amount of money to pay rent, buy food, pay your basic services, that's a substantial amount of money for everybody in the country. And if you, I like to see some of Ty's modelling on this front. That could cause the inflation that people are talking about. It could mean if the government tried to do other activities, it could exceed the amount of money creation we actually want the government to do. So my thinking is like a switch. Okay, you have an option. You have employment, and that could be self-employment, also being a capitalist. Let's not forget that. Or you can be on a job guarantee where you have coercion about the type of job you do, as Alex is saying, or UBI, where you don't have that coercion, but your situation, less money coming in, but still enough for you to survive.
Okay, so it's not an easy one for you because you're going to look at it always from a system point of view. I guess from a personal point of view, if you were saying this problem has solved you is just the dynamism. It allows for innovation or more innovation. Ty, what about you?
What do I think a UBI is?
What does it solve?
Your definition of UBI.
Again,
what does it solve for you is the question that Alex is asking.
What problem does
for me, from a social perspective, it gives a base level of subsistence. So it's addresses poverty and distributional issues with money in the economy, in layman's terms.
But for you,
my opinion.
And for you personally as well, I mean, Alex's question was maybe not necessarily aimed at that, but I was just trying to gauge that as well. For you personally, what would it do?
I didn't mean personally like to your
better.
personal self. I meant like in your personal opinion.
Definition. Yeah.
Understood.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's fine. Mike?
Yeah, I think a lot of what happens in the economy traditionally, certainly in the United States, is job centric, right? Minimum wage, unemployment insurance, healthcare insurance is usually tied to your employer or traditionally. And so if we were to sort of replace a lot of the social safety net stuff with a UBI, it probably is more efficient and takes it out of the realm of job-centric things and into sort of a minimum standard of living kind of thing, more like a social security program for the elderly. And I think the problem it solves potentially is as technology progresses, as AI and robotics, and I know Steve is going to be concerned about the energy demands and all that, but assuming we got some nuclear power or something that's going to help in that realm, more and more people are going to be unnecessary job-wise, right? I think our good friend John Maynard Keynes talked about this, in the economic possibilities for our grandchildren in 1930. He kind of said, he predicted kind of what we're seeing today. What are we going to do with ourselves when, technology solves a lot of the economic problem? So perhaps, that is ultimately the thing that it solves.
For me, it solves the problem of, and this is from personal experience, so I don't know the modeling, right? But similar to Steve, actually, I'm feeling like a bit Steve me too at the moment, but I had a similar experience in Australia as well, not being out of work so much, but just that there was a lot of pressure economically during the Great Recession. So after 2008, and in Australia, the introduction of I think it was the only country that did it. Basically, they went the opposite of everywhere else. They didn't have austerity. They did do two big stimulative payouts to people.
I have no idea who's responsible for that.
No idea. Some economists, some heterodox economists.
Idiot in Western Sydney, I think. Yeah. Okay.
So that's good. So I'm indebted to Steve already. So that's one reason why I still have to buy him a few more rounds of drinks, just from getting those checks. But what it did was, for me personally, it gave me and a bunch of mates who put that money together a chance to do something very different to the work that we were doing, which was struggling. So although it wasn't out of work, it was definitely a precarious time economically, and it gave options. So I'm not saying everyone does that, but what it does is suddenly you've got equity agency. So for me, it solves a problem that people have where they don't have enough choices. And if all they're going to do is what they've always done and no one gives them a break, I think you have a lack of innovation in the economy generally. That's my issue. And I think we need a lot more innovation going on at the moment than what we've got, because the ideas are dumb. Basically, we're all stuck in a rut. So that's basically what I think.
Okay. So now I'm going to give my answer, which I think might help tie together some of the things that you guys are saying and some of the comments from the chat, which is that UBI solves the problem of how to distribute money into the economy without breaking anything, right? So the economy always needs money flowing through it. If you're living in a monetary economy, where does that money come from? And right now, the way we do it is we use monetary policy to, make credit conditions easier so that it'll be more profitable for businesses to borrow money and hire people and push money out to people through wages, right? So we've got this financial sector, and we've got this labor market that the government has kind of taken over or kind of pushed around using it as a tool to push money to consumers. And this is a very inefficient way of getting money to people, and it causes a lot of harm, right? It takes away people's freedom. It forces them to get their money kind of through this channel. If you're not, getting it through a job, then you're getting it through some kind of financial something or capital ownership or something like that. It distorts the allocation of capital and labor, the way we distribute money right now. Now, instead of doing that, you can just hand people money, right? That's the problem that it solves. Now, when the way you get people money is broken in this way, then it causes unnecessary poverty, unnecessary restrictions on freedom, and all kinds of other, issues, right? So you hear basic income supporters, they're like, oh, basic income is the solution to poverty. Basic income is a safety net. No, it's not a safety net. That's not the point of basic income. It's the normal way that people get their money. It's just the economy's source of money, right? And the source that we're using now is highly problematic and dysfunctional, right? So that's kind of the answer that I would give. And then there are people, in the comments who are saying like, well, what about these other services? What about universal education, healthcare, various other services? Yes, of course, there are plenty of services that the government should provide the people, right? And UBI can be one of those services, right? You do need a source of money. It's not like UBI or no UBI. It's UBI or some other way of pushing money into the economy. And the way we're doing it now is very distortionary to the allocation of labor and capital, and very harmful to people's well-being.
On your UBI, I mean, my idea of UBI, as I said, is a switch. There'd be three potential ways you could get money. One is in the private or government employment, or private employer, so the capitalist or worker situation. There's a job guarantee, and there'd be a basic income as something which, if you didn't have the other two, then you got the basic income. Now, when you say universal, does that mean instead that you would be imagining giving literally everybody in the country a UBI check every day?
UBI goes to everyone, whether you have a job or not, right? It's not like an alternative to getting money from a job, right?
Now that raises an issue for me, because that then says, well, just what level of UBI is necessary that you're going to give people a survivable income, and that
no, it's not about survivable. It's not about that. It's about distributing money efficiently, right? It's about there's some amount of money that we're pushing to people through unnecessary jobs and wages, and by overstimulating the financial sector, what level of UBI allows us not to have to do that anymore?
And then that's the thing where I think you differ, Alex, and I want you to unpack that a bit more, the calibrated aspect, because it might be very small, but
right.
What you're aiming to solve a problem that's specific, that's not related to what a lot of people normally talk about. So I wanted to go into that a bit more. What do you mean by calibrated, and how would that function?
Right. So this ties into what Mike was saying before about how it's really hard to model this because you don't know how people are going to change their behavior. And I think that's exactly right. We don't know what level of UBI the economy can sustain. And so what I generally advocate is that we start with a low amount and gradually increase the amount and see how people's behavior changes, right? So if it turns out people are super inherently lazy and, a tiny amount of money will cause everyone to stop working, well, then maybe the level of UBI that you settle on isn't going to be very high. But you have to feel that out, and you can find that out. And then there are other things you can do. There are, taxes and other policies that will affect the level of UBI the economy can sustain as well, right? So, people in the chat are talking, some of them are talking as if like UBI is this like market fundamentalist thing or something like that. It's like, no, your economy, regardless of what else you're doing, your economy needs a source of money, right? So universal healthcare, I think that's really important, right? It doesn't change the fact that you need a source of money for the economy. And if you're not using UBI, then you're using something else, and it might be something that's kind of dysfunctional and harmful to people.
This is what ways, in terms of what a source of income is, it's employment or profit, or being in the finance sector. And I'm finding your idea difficult, actually, from the point of view that if you actually have a UBI that doesn't let you survive. To my way of thinking, a universal basic income has to give people sufficient income that they can survive with the basic costs. They're not going to accumulate anything out of the UBI, but they can pay their rent, their food, etc., etc. Now that then means you've got that gives you a minimum per person, and then if you multiply that by everybody in the country, you're talking quite a substantial amount of money creation, which will be created by the government, same way it does right now by, the same way it creates fiat money now by spending more than it takes back in taxation. But that sounds like an extremely large slab of money. I couldn't see it being, less than, say, 20% of GDP. Then I start to worry, as some of the critics of UBI do, about, well, what that's going to, is that going to give you just inflation, excessive demand on real resources and so on. So that's, like a UBI at that level, where it's everybody gets it regardless of whether they're working or not. That, to me, given how much it has to be survivable for the individual, those are two constraints that are so far apart. I'm worried that you can't square the circle on that front.
Well, what you're talking about is what I call a subsistence UBI, right? So we don't know what level of UBI the economy can handle, right? Is it that high? Is it up to the level of subsistence UBI? Maybe. Is it below that? Maybe. Is it above that? Maybe, right? We have to find out. We can only find out by calibrating, by gradually increasing the amount. But I mean, I think that this partly gets to the issue of what's the problem that UBI solves. If the problem that UBI solves isn't poverty, then you don't need to get it to a subsistence level, right? Like, that's not important. What's important is that you eliminate the other ways that we're distributing money that are causing active harm.
What are the ones are you thinking of eliminating?
A easy monetary policy that stimulates the financial sector and pushes money to people through jobs that are otherwise unnecessary.
Well, like get rid of the finance sector.
No, not get rid of the finance sector. Just have tighter monetary policy. Just rein it in, right? So that ideally you want to get to a point where you're kind of maximizing the extent to which investment of capital is actually like investment in productive capital, and that you're allocating labor in a way that kind of maximizes people's productivity and doesn't waste their time or other resources. I know you're a guy, Steve, who's very into trying to figure out how to address climate change and all of that. If you don't have UBI, then your money distribution mechanism is going to be wasting resources, right? It's going to be wasting time.
This is one area where I think climate UBI is essential, because when we realize, and it's not a case of if, it's when, and when we realize that we are simply using far too much energy and creating too much waste, so that we've got a drastic reduction in energy consumption. But we also therefore need to still enable people not to starve to death. Now, so that's where a UBI can be, pay people not to work in areas which are bullshit jobs, using David Graeber's great term there. You want to shut down bullshit jobs. You don't want the enormous industries. Like, for example, I think one of the first industries that will get shut down when we realize the energy damage we're doing is the entire tourism sector. Okay. Now that's a huge number of people. Okay. So suddenly you wouldn't have international flights anymore. Or lots of unemployed, airline pilots and stewards and so on. So you want to be. But then again, it comes back to, if you're going to keep those, pay people not to work, to reduce the energy consumption we're using and give us a chance to reorient the economy before we destroy it. That's still an enormous amount of money for saying everybody gets it, rather than just those who are affected by having their job shut down because it's a bullshit job or it's a ecology damaging job.
I think paying people not to work is maybe that's useful, but it's maybe a different problem from the problem UBI solves, right? Like, you don't want certain people working specific jobs or something like that, so you pay them not to do those things or something like that. Whereas UBI is just like, in general, we don't want to over incentivize work and we don't want to under incentivize work. It's kind of like a more kind of macroeconomic thing. I think, and it's not, we don't know what our environment can sustain if we're going to avert the climate crisis, if that's even we don't know if it's possible to avert the climate crisis. We don't know if it's possible to avert the climate crisis without killing a lot of people or something like that, right? We just don't know. And maybe we have some ideas, and we know it's going to be hard. But one of the things about UBI that's nice is that if you want to kind of tighten your belt or something like that, it's not like, okay, we're imposing austerity on the economy through taxes and tighter monetary policy, and you get this kind of disordered chaotic collapse of like, jobs get destroyed and some people fall into poverty and other ones don't and something like that. It's more you're kind of, everyone's taking this, bearing the same costs together. Like, oh, well, we're going to set it up so that the level of consumer spending the economy can sustain is lower, and the UBI is going to be lower. And how do you get the UBI lower without having deflation or something like that? Well, you might have to have taxes, or you could you want to kill the tourism industry, you tax carbon emissions or all the fuel that people use to get around and do their tourism. No one wants to get on a plane because it's too expensive, that kind of thing. All of this stuff is reasonable and it's all compatible with a UBI. But if you don't have a UBI, just even on its own, you're wasting resources as a consequence of needing to distribute money to consumers, right? You're creating unnecessary jobs, making people do unnecessary work, using materials and natural resources that otherwise wouldn't need to be used because you're forcing money to people in this way.
The interesting thing is, I think people would be listening, especially anybody that either does work now or perhaps employs people. And I guess the thing in the back of the head is they like, well, surely if it was a useless job, it wouldn't exist because the private sector is so efficient at rooting out inefficiencies and so on. And so I think there's a lot of people trying to wrap their heads around that, as I'm guessing. How does, to me, why are we laughing? Are you laughing at one of the comments?
I'm laughing because I work at a university where there's probably a 3-to-1 ratio of administrators to faculty.
It's not an efficient private, lean and mean private sector job,
it's
apparently.
Like, you always wonder, a lot of them even say, I don't even know what my job is, but I'm here to help.
Yeah, well, to be honest, in education, there's some good arguments for why it should be inefficient, so that people really do, there's a lot to be said for that, I think. But generally speaking, the idea that there's any waste out there is anathema to a lot of people. They're like, no, both my job and I'm an employer maybe, and so on. So, and this is why we need Ty's modeling in a second here. But my instinct, the model in my head, is that if you do bring in a calibrated UBI slowly, then you start to find out where the hell this fat is. People just go, do you know what? I don't need to do this. And you know what? Somebody else goes, we didn't need that function either. Let's get rid of that, and so on. But you would find out only by having a calibrated UBI. That's my thinking.
I think if you believe that markets allocate resources efficiently, then you necessarily don't believe that it's possible for the government to distort markets away from efficient allocation, because that's exactly what the government is doing right now through monetary policy. That's what they're doing by keeping interest rates low and kind of trying to stimulate demand through the financial sector and the labor market, right? If they, it can't be possible that if the market was if the market allocates resources efficiently without that, then it's still allocating resources efficiently once the government is doing that. It's just a logical impossibility. Now, it's true that when the government stimulates the financial sector to push money to people, easy monetary policy, it's true that actually does boost GDP. So that might seem a little bit strange. So maybe it actually is productive spending or productive policy or something like that. But it's actually coming in through the demand side, right? The money is going to consumers through wages, right? And they are buying stuff. And that's what's causing the increase in GDP. It's not that the investment is productive, right? It's that you've created jobs and you're using those jobs as a way of pushing money to people. And, people brought up David Graeber, his book, Bullshit Jobs. I've read it. I think it's up there behind me. You can't, where is it? There it is. But what he's talking about is not what I'm talking about. He's talking about jobs that feel like bullshit. There are jobs that could feel really important and really useful and really meaningful that go away in a universal basic income world. And that's because what the economy ends up needing and what the economy ends up incentivizing doesn't line up necessarily with what people feel is actually useful and productive, right? Those are not the same thing. And David Graeber is talking about people's feelings, and I'm talking about what would be efficient for the allocation of resources.
Ty, this is time to look at modeling, don't you think? Can we do that?
Well, you can go look at my blog, right? That's be a little much for this show, but there's so much to unpack here hearing you guys talk. One of the things that's been coming up is a UBI 1-for-1 deficit spending, and from what I read on the UBI material, it's not, and how I modeled it, ultimately it's not. So there is a taxation for higher income earners, right, that fund this program, which makes sense because it's a distributional issue. So one for one deficit dollar spending, as I understand it, that's not how a UBI is proposed by the main framers. And I get a lot of this from talking to Scott Santons. This is how he explained to me that there's no intention for it to be a one for one deficit spending where we're just injecting, right? It's heavily focused on taxating certain sectors of the economy. Another thing that kind of came up, or I think we're all on agreement on, is the financial sector is far too large, right? And that's a critical issue. Now, how do we reduce that exploitation on the rest of society is a different story. So a tighter monetary policy is simply taxing or is simply charging higher interest rates to households and firms, productive firms. So a tighter monetary policy isn't necessarily a good thing, and I'm not advocating like the MMT base zero rate policy by any means. It has to be nuanced again. So it's not necessarily our settlement system, i.e. the central banks that are necessarily creating that problem. It is the financial sector and commercial loans going out excessively, and how do we fix that? That's kind of interesting. But basically, to sum up, some of the modeling I've done, it seems, and right, all models, George Bach said, all models are wrong, but some are insightful. It seems like some of the insights are that a job guarantee is a little better if it was fully developed, a little better as a counter-cyclical policy to the business cycle, right? Because you're dealing, as Mike was saying, this is a problem of stock. So you have a buffer stock of unemployed people or potentially employed people. Whereas a UBI in the modeling, if done correctly, can directly achieve everybody's personal goals. And Alex was bringing up, what is a UBI to you, right? For me, it's a way to live. Like a person has a base level of income that they can cover the necessities. So from that respect, it's instantaneous. And it occurs instantaneously, whereas a job guarantee is highly problematic because you have different regions distributing that job guarantee. Does it actually cause some migration in these different regions? If one region has a better job guarantee program, i.e. better jobs than another region, right? Does that cause some issues? So that came up as well. And actually, I didn't even use that model. I used Jay Forrester's old urban dynamics model that kind of addressed that in a roundabout way. So that's kind of, where I sit. Both UBI is very direct and instantaneous, but if it's not managed right, and what I mean by managed is how is it financed? Yeah, there's a big potential that it's inflationary. It causes incorrect distribution of income throughout the economy. Whereas a job guarantee, it's a lot better counter-cyclical policy, but it is heavily capital intensive. So, i.e., when you're running a job guarantee program, you're facing what's called depreciation, right? You have to have capital assets in place. Who owns those capital assets? And when the job guarantee is not being used, those capital assets are depreciating. Shit is wearing out, right? And it has to be fixed. And there's an additional cost to that that's not really productive to the economy while we're in boom times, right? So that's kind of the summary of my modeling. People can find it on my Patreon, patreon.com/relearning economics.
And Ty, there was an amount that's quite specific that went into your modeling for the UBI, which I think was about $1,200 a month, just back of envelope, just to know where the inflationary effect was happening.
So for my macro model, really ultimately I'm looking at total population and total spending into the program. So that could vary over time, right? I didn't have, there was not a microeconomic analysis, right? It was more of how would it affect the macro economy. And that is an issue. That is a political issue that Alex brought up that would create headwinds for UBIs in order to push something through. a government body, you've got to vet it financially. And if you don't have a solid number of where we're going to start and what's going to happen after we start, that program's dead on arrival, right? So we have to kind of establish what that base rate, and obviously after that, does it get indexed with inflation so it increases over time? Like there's lots of programs here in Canada where it's indexed to inflation, like old age security here, and it sequentially goes up each year.
So a traditional idea in economics, and certainly in development economics, is what is known as the dependency ratio. And basically that's the ratio of middle-aged folks to the sum of the very young and the very old. But what you're really after is the people in the mid-age groups are the people who make things. And so they have to make things for themselves and for the dependents, the very young and the very old. So really start talking about the real economy and really how productive they are. So let me give you an example where I'm going with this. I grew up in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, right on Lake Michigan, hour north of Milwaukee. So one thing in Sheboygan that is popular is a stump fiddle. Now, anybody wants to know what a stump fiddle is, go ahead and Google it. It's an acquired taste. So, a UBI is a direct injection, a stream, a flow into the system of money. It puts a floor on things that's non-job centric, like a minimum wage, right? And so it's efficient, and it has a lot of good points, as Alex mentioned. Not using traditional monetary policy and.
Hold on, Mike. How do you spell this strump?
Stump. STUMPF, I think. Fiddle.
Okay.
If we can that'd be great.
Yeah.
It's also
so what I'm getting at is, let's say I'm in Sheboygan and I get a UBI check every month, and I want to just get into stump fiddling. I used to do something else. I used to make widgets. How many people give a damn that I can play a stump fiddle really good? I might find value, and a handful of people might. But you get into this issue of the real economy, and I suppose that touches on inflation as well.
Well, the industrial policy doesn't go away, of course, just because you've got some UBI. And I think that's where I think I struggle with people who've arrived at the idea that one thing must be completely taking over the whole thing. Like UBI must fix everything, including everyone's living costs all fully, or a job guarantee must do that. Instead of, well, hang on, don't we want even for me, for instance, a UBI that reduced the working week by a day would make a massive difference, because you've still got your strump fiddling, whatever you're doing. You might be able to do that for a day, but you're now more efficient maybe, or maybe you just only need to make widgets three days a week. It's not I don't see why it always has to be an all or nothing. You're just changing the economy slightly and making it perhaps freer for people, because we realized there was a whole lot of stuff we're doing we didn't need to do. And that would be a big breakthrough, I think. So that's kind of that's what's in the back of my head. Steve?
You use the word calibrated, Alex. Have you tried calibrating? Do you have any concepts about it? What level of UBI you're talking of?
No, I mean, I think in order to actually calibrate, you'd have to do it, right? You'd have to implement a UBI on the scale of a large economy and gradually increase the amount. So what really needs to be sold is the policy of a calibrated basic income, and then you go out and calibrate it. I don't think you can try to calibrate through a model or something like that, but that's based on a lot of assumptions about how people will respond to incentives and how their behaviors will change and stuff like that.
Yeah, but the other thing, I was using university, everybody gets it.
Mm-hmm.
So you work out what the level is, and everybody gets paid that per week, whether they're working or they're not. Okay. Mm-hmm. Now I've got to say that's one thing I'm critical of, because part of what we're talking, like a job guarantee, one reason people talk in favor of a job guarantee, it's counter-cyclical. If you lose your job, you get an income from it working in a role which is a job guarantee position, and therefore there's more spending during a downturn than there would be if it wasn't for the job guarantee. Now, I see the UBI in a similar sense. I think that the UBI I'd see as a counter-cyclical thing. When there's a downturn, two things happen. People who lose their jobs can no longer afford to pay their costs, which means they end up in a personally stressed situation, but also there's less demand in the economy because the money they're getting as a wage is no longer there. And it's not the workers' fault that capitalism has had an investment slump. It tends to be the financial and investment side of things. So I would prefer to see UBI, which had the same counter-cyclical role as the job guarantee has, but a lower level. That's what I'm thinking of when I think in terms of UBI. And by universal, I mean it's universally available. If you decide to leave your job, then you can get the UBI, no questions asked. In Australia, at some stage, they did something which was quite penal, which is not amazing for Australia. It's an ex-convict colony, but you had to prove that when you lost your job, you had to prove that you were sacked. You couldn't lose your job voluntarily, that sort of thing. So I would rather have a three-tiered system. You work for a living in a private employer or a government job. You do a job guarantee, which has a higher amount than a universal basic income, but you lose some freedom in what you can do in that case. And the UBI is available there for the third option, a lower level still, but sufficient to pay your cost of living. And I'm afraid I cannot see a UBI doing the two extremes you're talking about if everybody gets it. Because if everybody gets it, and at the same time you want to make it something that an individual can survive upon, then you're talking, 20% of GDP? I just think that's feasible. But if you say it's something which is universally available, then it's those who are not in a job, whether they volunteer to leave or they get sacked, and they then take the choice between a UBI and a job guarantee. That to me is more. That's more both. It's feasible for the individual. It's feasible at the collective level, and it does the counter-cyclical thing that I think is also necessary to mean that the booms and slumps of capitalism don't end up meaning, largesse and starvation for workers.
Yeah, so I think part of what's going on here is a semantic issue, right? You and I are using the term UBI differently.
In different ways, yeah.
Yes. What you are calling a UBI is what people in my circles usually call guaranteed income. So it's money that goes to people if they don't have another source of money, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the problem that it solves is fundamentally different. It's to top people up, so they're not in poverty. It's really for poor people, right? It's for people who don't have another source of income. Yeah. Whereas UBI, it solves this more macroeconomic problem of, well, the money is being distributed into the economy in this way that is causing problems. And that includes the people who already have money now. Like the way rich people get money is broken. They have a lot of money, but they got it through a system that's broken. And if you replace, the current money distribution mechanisms with UBI, it's not like you're still in the same kind of economy.
When you say replace, you're not talking about actually replacing wages and replacing profits, are you?
Some of them, yeah, because you're tightening monetary policy and you're eliminating a lot of jobs and you're eliminating a lot of wages. Yes, that's right. And you're eliminating a lot of fixed income and income from capital assets, especially financial capital assets, that kind of thing. Yeah, the whole thing with UBI is that you're replacing growth of unstable private sector debt with more stable public sector debt, right? You're spending money directly into the economy instead of trying to stimulate the private sector to print your money for you, right? That's the problem that UBI solves. So it's a fundamentally different problem from the problem that guaranteed income solves. And it's a fundamentally different problem from the problem that the job guarantee solves. The job guarantee solves the problem of how to bring the economy to full employment, how to eliminate involuntary unemployment, that kind of thing, which I would argue is a non-problem. And the fact that we're kind of stuck in this full employment paradigm is largely John Maynard Keynes's fault. And he kind of got macroeconomics off in the wrong direction. But I think, it doesn't have to be that way. I think Keynes is really smart and he got a lot of other things right and, that kind of thing. And you mentioned, the job guarantee being counter-cyclical. Yeah, it's counter-cyclical, but UBI ends the business cycle, right? It solves the underlying problem that causes the business cycle in the first place, which is this accumulation of unstable private sector debt obligations, right? That eventually, get so brittle that they have a cascading collapse. And then, it solves the underlying credit cycle. Now you could have a recession in a universal basic income world.
I'm sorry, I don't see that. Obviously one of my major interests is getting rid of the Ponzi scheme nature of the financial sector, reducing it. I'd like to see the financial sector at least reduced by at least 2/3 compared to where it is, be the servant of the industrial sector rather than the master. So on that side, I'm completely on board. But what I'm puzzled by is how you think the UBI would eliminate the business cycle. because the business cycle comes from struggles over the distribution of income. Now, partially it would reduce the need to struggle for workers because if they're getting a UBI which is sufficient to live on, then there's less, need to demand wage rises as part of the business cycle. But you're still going to have profits, you're still going to have investment, you're still going to have booms and slumps in capitalism. And I can't see how you think a UBI would eliminate that, unless you mean you're eliminating other sources of income. And that's...
Yeah, I mean, you have the booms and slumps, when the dominoes build up and they get too close together, and then, one knocks over the next one, right? And then you have your crash, and then you have your slump. If you keep the dominoes far enough apart, then any one domino can fail, and it doesn't cause a crisis. It doesn't cause, a recession or something like that. It's not. I mean, it's the reason why we have this phenomenon of instability is because of the way we are using the economy, using the market to push money to consumers, when really the government can hand people money directly and get out of the way of the financial sector instead of kind of ballooning it up, right? The government is stimulating the financial sector.
If I can put words in your mouth, Alex, you can correct me. This question of the oil in the economy as a lubricant of money, rather than, and not confusing it with fuel. I think, Steve, you've talked about this before, the idea, and I think neoclassical economists seem to get this a lot, where you're talking about money as if it's fuel, it's oil, which is, I think, what Alex is talking about here. If you keep lubricating the economy enough, then you don't get as much of the crash up and down, because human beings individually at the micro level are able to sustain themselves to some degree and keep going.
No,
fall in heat.
That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying money is always flowing through the economy from consumers to producers. And where do consumers get their money from, right? They can get it from UBI, or they can get it from jobs. And if you're insisting that they get it from jobs, then you have to kind of fiddle with the market to create those jobs. And not only those unproductive jobs, but if you're doing it through this is a problem that the job guarantee solves, right? Like, if you gave it to people through job guarantee jobs, then that bypasses the financial sector. So at least you wouldn't have the financial instability aspect of it. But if you're trying to stimulate the financial sector and hoping some of that money leaks out through jobs constantly, then you have this growing private sector debt bubble that you can't stop because you're using it as the economy's money source.
But it's still okay. But it's still a flow. It's a stock and flow. Money is what we're talking about going through the economy.
I think of money as a flow primarily. Yeah.
And
which is what I'm talking about.
You're also agreeing there are two sources of money creation: government money by spending more than it takes back in taxation, private sector by banks lending out more than they take back in repayments. So
or you could just say government borrowing or private sector borrowing.
Well, the government doesn't borrow. Okay, I want to get away from that particular term. The government creates.
I would say that borrowing and money issuance are the same thing, and the private sector can print money, and the government can print money, and the private sector can.
Well, when I do the mathematics of it, what I get is the government creates money by going to negative equity. That's the process. It spends more than it takes back, and that creates money not through borrowing. The actual course of government money creation is by going into negative equity, which creates positive equity, which turns up as entries in bank balances. So that's what creates money from the government side. The borrowing of the government does not create money, whereas the borrowing of the private sector does create money.
I mean, that's a valid way of framing it, right? But you could also say, like, if I have a bunch of money and I decide to spend it into the economy and I otherwise wouldn't have, then I'm creating money too, right? And let's say that
you're spending existing money.
I'm releasing money. I'm releasing money into the economy that otherwise wouldn't be there. Whether you want to call that creating or something else, it doesn't matter that much. Well, if I go to if I issue my own loan liability and I go to a bank and they'll say, we accept this liability, we'll give you dollars for it. Maybe that's the point where you say that the money is being created. Is it at the point where I spend, or is it at the point where I borrow? You could make the same arguments for the government.
I think let's get our terms right here, because one thing I find extremely difficult in coping with in public conversations about money is people think that, they say, I make money. What would I mean? I make a profit. Okay. I make a living. People who there's two institutions in our society that make money. leaving out into what happens with the export market as well. But the private banks create money by lending more than they take back in repayments. The government creates money by going into negative equity. It doesn't create it by borrowing. Borrowing changes the asset that backs the money the government creates. So that, please, I got enough neoclassicals making a shit of this thing. That
I think
people actually.
I think we agree. I think we agree on the mechanics. And I think if you and I independently went and drew up the balance sheets, we draw up the exact same balance sheets. And I think we each have opinions about what kind of language we want to use to describe this. And I feel very strongly about using the same language to describe what the private sector is doing, what the public sector is doing. And you feel very strongly about using different language.
It's simply wrong language. I mean, I've done the accounting. The government does not create money by borrowing. It creates money by going to negative equity. If it didn't issue bonds, it'd still create money. Okay, so let's say you're treading on my territory here. So I'm saying this is the mathematics comes out that way. So
well, Steve, it's my territory too. And my question for you is, if I go into negative equity, am I not creating money then?
No, you're not creating money. You're going broke. Okay, you go to negative equity, you're going to run out of money at some point. Okay, the government.
If I borrow money to buy a house, I'm in negative equity, right?
No, you're in.
Well, I guess the house is
no
change.
Is an asset, right? Your debts go up and your assets go up identically when you first take out.
I mean, you could make the same argument for the government. You could say that the government isn't actually in negative equity because of
you could make it, but you'd be wrong in accounting and
something like that.
Hey, hang on. Right? I'm the bloke who designed the software that Ty uses to do this work.
All right.
Okay, you're wrong on that particular point. Forget about semantics. You're wrong. The government does not create money by borrowing. It creates money by going to negative equity. Now, what I'm like, I'm finding your position confusing, as you can tell, because what you're talking about is a universal basic income, and you're saying it's calibrated. But I therefore see if it's going to be a basic income, that to me implies enough for somebody to live on. If you then say it's everybody, what you say, so your basic income is not enough to live on.
The basic income doesn't mean it's enough to live on. It just means it's something that everybody gets. It's a basic thing that everybody gets. It's a basic service that everyone receives.
But democratically can be increased or decreased, but the facility is there presumably, so that it could be increased if we needed to. Let's say in a crisis.
It's not a particular amount of money. It's a way of getting people money, right? Is another way to put it.
And then you've got the democratic debate to work out how much it should be as well.
I don't know if the process should be democratic or technocratic. I would probably advocate for kind of a politically independent agency that would be managing the UBI. Yeah.
So I got a couple of questions, maybe a shorter one, a longer one for Alex. So the shorter one is, in your mind, would UBI payments be tax-free?
Yeah, I mean, I think the UBI is equivalent to a negative head tax, right? A negative poll tax, right? It's just a tax that everyone pays equally in a negative amount.
Okay. The longer run question is, we're talking about modeling, talk about theory. How about case studies? Are there, I think Finland somebody said in the chat, maybe Finland tried it. I know Switzerland had it up for a vote and they voted it down, but are there actual examples where, at least at a small level, these ideas have been tried out, going from like the virtual world to like the real world, that you can elaborate on?
So there's a lot of marketing and branding around UBI and basic income. And there are a lot of these various kind of pilot programs and trials and studies that kind of use the basic income name. Now they're starting to shift more towards guaranteed income. The stuff that I care about is the macroeconomic effects, right? Like, how is the central bank going to change their monetary policy, right? And how is it going to affect labor demand and labor supply in the overall economy, right? Like, I would argue that labor demand is artificially elevated, and universal basic income will bring down both labor demand and labor supply, right? You can't test these things on a small scale. So if you're just trying to figure out like how people's behavior changes if you hand them money, there's plenty of studies about that, and some people try to use them in support of UBI. I don't think they're not really UBI studies, and they don't support UBI. They're something else.
Did Andrew Yang, when he was running for president last time, support this? I'm going from memory here.
So his plan was a UBI. It was a real UBI. It was $1,000 to everyone unconditionally, everyone in the United States, I guess, or every citizen. So it did technically qualify as a UBI. It wasn't it was not the calibrated in the way that I'm talking about it. And he was justifying it using different, ideas. He was talking about it as like, okay, robots are going to take everyone's jobs. We need to give everyone, this $1,000 a month kind of thing. And he called it a dividend, freedom dividend. I don't like that framing for UBI. I wanted to talk to him. I heard, oh, hey, there's this guy running for president who actually wants to do UBI. And I met him a few times, but I never had like a real sit down meeting with him. I had one scheduled. And then he went on Joe Rogan and got really popular, and he never got to really get my input. But I don't know, maybe if he talked to me, he'd be president right now or something. I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, I think he has his own podcast now, I think.
Yeah. Yeah,
he does. And if it's the branding of it, the naming of it, which I do think is important in terms of how it lands with people. Dividend, you're not okay where they call it a freedom dividend, which is more evocative or evocative of different things.
Well, I should say that I'm super not interested in the politics of UBI, or Ty was talking about like, oh, if we think about it this way, it's more politically viable or something like that, or compared to alternatives, like maybe it's more palatable to, okay, all right. I'm not into the politics side of it. I'm not into the movement side of it as much. I'm more into just kind of understanding, kind of what it is, what problem it solves. And I hope I can be a resource for the people who are more involved with that kind of stuff, like Scott Santens and people like that. Andrew.
So we're very good. Where are we up to? I think it'd be good. Ty, if we explored all of the issues around them on the modeling, because I just want to know if there's no way to effectively, in your experience looking at this at the moment, and Steve, you too, if there's enough resource, can you model this at a macro level better than doing all the UBI pilots that seem to be kicking around? Is that a better way to look at whether or not this would be effective and get good advice to government policymakers?
It would be, because I mean, if there are modelling different flavours of UBI, and obviously my flavour is a counter-cyclical one. Okay, that UBI is available but not accessible if you are in employment or working in a job guarantee. Now that means a UBI which fluctuates, and but at the same time at the individual level, it's sufficient for the individual to live. So they can pay their rent, they can pay for food, etc., etc. The one you're talking about, and I find that if you say the word calibration, then you have to provide some numbers at some point. If you try, everybody gets it, and then I don't think at the same time, then it can be sufficient. So what's the benefit if somebody finds himself on a UBI, and it's a UBI everybody gets, then calibrating it, I think, is going to mean that person's going to starve. To me, that's not addressing the side of the UBI that I see, which it means people can stay alive and do something other with their time than working in a job they're assigned to through a job guarantee system. So, I think the sort of stuff that Dave did in Australia, that I did as well, starting a business effectively, on a cash flow that meant I didn't have to work at the same time, so I could work on the business. You've got to. If I model it, I think at one extreme I'd get people dying. I've actually said, okay, it's a UBI that isn't sufficient to live on, then some of my workers would be dying of starvation while they're in the UBI. But if it's sufficient at the other level, then you're talking like 25%. I'm only guessing, but if it's calibration, then you should be providing numbers like that to say what number are you thinking about in terms of a proportion of GDP or a per capita payment.
What I like about this conversation, both talking about modeling and Alex's ideas, is that we're talking about designing or redesigning society or social institutions or the socioeconomic system. And if you think about it, we don't do that. We design our physical systems like an airplane or a bridge, right? And we optimize this, and we are aware of the trade-offs and what have you. But our socioeconomic systems, we let them evolve however they evolve to whatever state that they're in. I always tell my students, nobody in their right mind would design the United States tax code from scratch, right?
70,000 pages, I believe Elon said it was just recently.
Yeah, it's some crazy. So it's evolved to its current state.
I can think of some personality types that might. But anyway.
from a gazillion lobbyists and politics, who knows what, right? So, but we don't step back and say, how would we redesign the airplane, so to speak, the social airplane, right? And this conversation cries out for you, well, you need modeling tools to help think through the design. But you have people like Alex thinking outside the box, thinking differently, saying, well, what if we did it this way instead of that way? We're not throwing the airplane away, we're redesigning it. And I think we don't do that at all in terms of economics, social science, or wherever. We don't think about redesigning the social airplane.
Well, you assume everything that's perfect is because it's emergent, but actually, no. I think we're arriving at a point where we need to get very intentional about what's going on, and we seem to have better tools. You guys have kind of turned me on to the idea that the modeling is way more sophisticated than I've ever thought, and to although I don't pretend to be, into the system stuff, you guys are the experts in this. It opened my eyes to the fact that there is system modeling that's getting good enough to get to ask these sort of big questions and go, what would society be like if we did this? We're not going to get perfect answers, but we're able to ask more complex and bigger questions, which is great. So I definitely think that's going on.
One of the things we find with complex systems modeling as well is that you have to get away from thinking about solutions so much as thinking about trade-offs. And that is, if you think about a city, what makes a good city? Well, you want, low tax rate, good schools, low crime, open space, and you'll go through this laundry list of stuff you want. And you find out that, well, if you get more of this, you get less of that, and so forth. So you have to say, okay, on net, if we try this redesign of the social airplane or that redesign, on net, how are we going to do? And of course, not everybody's going to agree on the weightings attached to the various aspects or characteristics that go into a quality socioeconomic system or whatever. So it's tricky business. The best you can do, I think, is make your case, right? And try and make it clear and logical and what have you. But we're not only don't we think that way, we don't teach students to think this way.
So I think that's right. I think there are always trade-offs. I think there are also cases where you can know that one thing is better than the other, and it's not just like what you prefer, right? Like if you know that you have, look at all this, I don't know, what's a good resource? Look at this forest. Let's chop it down and burn it, and then just make a bunch of mud and then you know that's worse than anything else you could possibly do with the forest, right? Maybe you could frame that in terms of trade-offs, like someone gets some utility out of chopping down and burning forests, or maybe everyone really enjoys a big bonfire or something like that. But really, you're kind of like, okay, which answer is the right answer, that you don't just chop down the forest and burn it for no reason, right? And I would argue that is what we're doing with our labor supply right now. We're wasting it. And we're wasting other resources.
You're seeing UBI as a way of reducing unnecessary work?
Yeah.
Okay.
And Steve, can I just pick up on this? And I just want to see if your thinking is the same as what I thought when Alex has talked about calibrated, is bringing it in. The reason I think, and Alex, again, you can tell me if I'm not, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but bringing it in calibrated slowly and working out what it does to the economy is the way that you can bring it in without just breaking stuff. And then you can find what the economy can handle. And this is where the bit was hard to model, I think, is you might find out that the economy can actually do a lot more with people doing a lot less activity than we currently do. And then that's a different question. Can people get by on that? We don't, at the moment, people don't have anything. So therefore, bringing a calibrated UBI to me is still better than nothing. Like Ty was saying before, if any of these were on the books, I'd be going, yeah, I'll sign up to that. I'll vote for that. So that was my thought. So does that make sense? Calibrated?
Yeah, that is exactly how I think about it. And to Steve's point, like, well, if we calibrate, then does that mean a lot of people are going to starve? Well, right now, using our less efficient, kind of more dysfunctional money distribution system, some people are starving, but not everybody is starving. Do you think more people are going to be starving if we replace that with UBI? I don't think so, right? Because you're turning down one money faucet and you're opening the other money faucet, right? And you're still keeping the flow of money in the economy balanced, and you're providing it directly to consumers evenly, and it's not wasting resources, and it's not being distributed inefficiently. So I would expect, whatever level of UBI you calibrate to, that people are going to be, on average, and probably especially the people who are worse off, are going to be better off than they are today, because you fixed something that was broken.
Question in the chat there, Alex, why not just reduce the working week? Keynes, did that and it seemed to work. So is there a, I guess it comes down to which problem we're trying to solve here, but in terms of wasted work, is legislating to reduce work overall one answer that you've thought about? Well,
not really. I mean, do you want everybody on their own farm, farming 10 minutes a week, using up all that land to produce the same, produce? Or do you want, kind of one person working full time and selling the produce to everybody? Like, which one of those is more efficient, right?
Well, farms are unique in that you can only maximize the utility on them to a certain point, and then that's it. You may as well down tools because you can't get any more out of the farm. But
maybe a farm was a bad example. Yeah. But there's reasons why people specialize, and I think it's okay for some people to specialize in working and some people to specialize in something that doesn't involve selling their labor. Reducing the work week, it kind of treats labor as if it's this scarce thing that needs to be rationed among people, and it's something that everybody wants or something like that. No, labor is a cost to people, and they are compensated through wages, right? So for some people that's worth it, and so for some people it's not. Different wages are going to incentivize different people different amounts, and that's totally fine. Reducing the work week is not, I think that would not, that would prevent us from eliminating some of this waste. And I think, in an ideal world, you wouldn't have minimum wage either, right? Because, like, you just pay people as much money as, provides an incentive for them to do the thing. And we don't have to live in this world where we're expecting to earn our living through a job, right? That is dysfunctional. And, some people are happy to earn money, even if they have other money, and we don't know how much UBI is going to correspond with kind of optimal labor allocation. And, I talk about calibration. I haven't done any calibrating. I don't even know how to do it, right? And this is something, I need help with. And in terms of modeling, like, I'm not a modeler. I tried the Minsky software, I think in 2014, 2015 or something like that.
It's a long time ago.
It kept crashing, so I stopped using it. I remember
it's
that.
a long time past that. Yeah, I mean, there's still bugs, but it's a far more sophisticated program.
It's better now. It's better now.
Maybe I can look at it again, but I didn't get the sense that it would be able to give me the kind of insights that I'm looking for, right?
Well, I mean, this calibration, let's focus on that word for a moment, because you've got to calibrate UBI at two ends, in my opinion. One is what the individual gets. The other is the macro, the economy scale impact of that distribution of money, because it is obviously going to be a monetary thing. And that's why I don't believe it can be universal, because I think it has to be sufficient for an individual to survive. Now, that therefore means you've got to look at what the individual has to spend to stay alive. It's obviously rent, food, heating expenses, etc., etc. And you're not talking living in a Taj Mahal, but it ends up being a substantial amount of money, maybe 1/3 of, maybe let's say half of what they might get as a salary. But then you multiply that by everybody in the country. Everybody gets it when they're working as well as they're not working. Then at the macro level, that's a substantial amount of money being created. And I can't see. I haven't done the numbers myself. I think you have to do the numbers. If you're going to use that term, you have to then work out what that implies. And that to me is going to be 10, 15% of GDP. And that for me feels too large to be sustainable at the macro level.
Isn't that welfare? Is that just a dole if it's just for some people? Or what am I missing?
Well, yeah, that's why I'm saying I'll be universally available, but not universally received. Whereas if universally received, then at the macro level, that's a constraint. You don't, like, if you look at the scale of government spending, for example, it's about 30% of GDP roughly. And there's a huge part of that which has to happen. Schools, hospitals, unfortunately, defence, etc., etc. That's got to be at least, if you leave out the social security side, which UBI can address, that's still at least 10, 15% of GDP. Now, if you're talking about adding a UBI on top of that, then you rapidly get up to the same scale of government spending as it is at the moment. And, you have to do the numbers. And I don't care whether you do Minsky or any other, now called Ravel, or any other software, but you really do have to attack that task. And if you, on the other hand, if you make it something which isn't sufficient to live on, then I don't see what the benefit is for the individual.
It sounds like, Steve, that you are really interested in this idea of a guaranteed income, and maybe you should have a guaranteed income person on here to talk about that.
That's true, but tell me what you mean by what it is. So again, the problem you think a UBI is solving appears to relate to what you think it does to the finance sector. So elaborate on that.
It solves the problem of how to distribute money into the economy without breaking other things. So that's without distorting the allocation of capital and labor, and without causing another thing that our current money distribution system does right now is it causes a really skewed distribution of income, right? So there are people who don't have jobs, there are people who do have jobs, there are people who own like all kinds of assets whose prices are going up and up and up due to the fact that we are stimulating the financial sector to push money to people through jobs, right? So there are a lot of things that are broken that wouldn't be broken if we just handed people their money directly instead, right? And there are people in the chat and even in this conversation who keep bringing up inflation, and it's like, inflation is when there's too much money chasing too few goods, and that's going to be true regardless of what your money source is for the economy, right? That's going to be true if you run the economy too hard and push too many wages to people. It's also going to be true if the basic income is too high, if the UBI is too high. So, and that's part of what calibration is about, right? There's a real level of consumer spending that the economy can handle, right? It's not, independent of what's going on with inflation. There's a real level of consumer spending that the economy can handle, and there has to be a source of money for that spending to occur.
So
right.
So here's the thing. This is a lot of great detailed conversation, but when we step back for a minute, it's all the same. So what the government does is it injects financial assets into the economy, and it can do it any number of ways, whether it's through services, some government spending program, a UBI. And what the act of that does is it redistributes the real resources in the private sector, right? So that's what's happening, right? And we can do that with the UBI. We can do that with basic services. We can do that with just a basic income to select few people. It all achieves that. And Alex is correct in the sense that any of that can be inflationary when it takes it into excess. But there's not really a level of consumption that, a baseline, like you mentioned. It's really a level of investment that is the true kind of trajectory path we want to always explore. That's where it starts. The after effect is consumption, right? So I just wanted to nuance that.
Well, you could imagine a steady state economy that's not investing, where it's just kind of got its productive capacity and it's producing a fixed amount of stuff, and everybody's consuming a fixed amount of stuff. You
always have to invest, right? There's always depreciation, right? There's always advancements. You can't
right. So let's say the amount of investment is just sufficient to cover the depreciation and replace your capital assets that have worn out, or that kind of thing.
Gross investment is positive, but net investment is zero.
Exactly.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we live in an evolving world, so we're never just going to.
I'm not saying that's the world we live in. Just for this thought experiment, right? You can imagine, right? Yeah. So
we're
then, what
never
are we
just going
talking?
to use a wheelbarrow forever. We're going to advance to a tractor, right? And then we're going to advance to a self-driving tractor, right? So there'll always be investment. So that's really the big fluctuation in the economy. Another thing too is we're never going to eliminate the business cycle, and capitalism is here to stay probably for the near future, over the coming decades. We'll evolve into another system.
Capitalism. What is capitalism? What does that mean?
Well, the capitalism, essentially the best form of it is you have people that own the means of capital and people that work for those people, and there's an interplay, and that interplay, it will go back to Marx, actually, is the cause of the business cycle, not the neoclassical perspective where there's this sudden shock of productivity and that creates a new business cycle. The business cycle is a phenomenon of that interplay between capitalists and workers, right? And there's nothing essentially wrong with that. You got to look at it through a temporal perspective. At one point, the wage earners are gaining the upper hand, and at another point, the capitalists are gaining the upper hand. It's the predator-prey model. Now, Steve's work, he came in, he started modeling the third factor, the third system state, which was the financial sector, which all of us are in agreement is very parasitic, right? And it's been growing over time. And if we've watched that growth of the financial sector since the 1970s, we've seen a corresponding drop in the wage share of workers over that period. We're all in agreement that that's a problem. But the business cycle itself is that interplay between workers and capitalists, and it always will be, right? And even if you remove, and we went to a system of communism, that interplay still exists because a group of people own the means of the resources and a group is working for that means of resources. And even if everybody owned a share of the means of production, right? If everybody owned a share and they got a dividend, there's still a payment system for labor, right? And that would fluctuate over time because everybody's bargaining in an economy. It doesn't matter if it's communism. It doesn't matter if it's capitalism. It doesn't matter if it's anarchy, right? So that interplay will always exist. You can smooth out that business cycle, as Keynes said, with proper government spending directed at the right areas of the economy. But that cycle will never go away. And a UBI and no other government program will ever give us that silver bullet where we hit this utopia of equilibrium. That is a fantasy of neoclassical economics.
Okay, so am I hearing you correctly in saying that the business cycle is caused by class struggle?
Yes.
Fundamentally, yeah. And also technological change, okay? That's because you then disturb some sectors of the economy, which the Schumpeter is probably the best on. If anyone has read a decent book on the investment side of the business cycle, then it's Schumpeter, Theory of Economic Development.
Creative destruction, all of that.
Yeah, but more sophisticated than just creative destruction. That was the throwaway phrase in Schumpeter's retirement book for raise money for his retirement. Capitalism, Socialism, Democracy. Probably one of the most boring books I've ever read. But you get cyclical, you get sectoral disturbances, which lead. I can be harsh, but sectoral causes, the disturbance, the technological change changes what sectors work, which ones don't. That'll give you cyclical behavior. But then you get workers and capitalists struggling over the distribution of income. That's another one. And what I've brought in my modeling is the finance sector being fundamentally parasitic, but also creating the money. How did you reach the conclusion that a UBI would reduce the power of the financial sector? I know that seems to be part of your argument as well.
Yeah, because the UBI is a source of money that can be an alternative to easy monetary policy. So it allows you to have permanently tighter monetary policy.
You mean not higher interest rates?
Yeah.
Okay. So why do you want higher interest rates?
For the reason I just said, that you have you rein in the financial sector, you prevent asset bubbles, you prevent financial instability. And the question is, why do we want lower interest rates, right? If we've been using lower interest rates, if we've been artificially kind of depressing interest rates to push money to consumers through jobs, then not only do you have this uneven distribution of income, you have this unproductive kind of market-based make work, you also have excessive financial instability, right? Altogether. You want the financial sector to be smaller, right?
Yeah, but that doesn't necessarily mean a higher
additional government spending will actually tend the interbank rate down to zero. So we're not artificially ever pushing the rate down. We're artificially pushing it up because we have in most capitalist countries, right, our GDP level of government spending, right, is around 20 to 35%, right? That in itself will always push the rates down, right? So it's not, it's actually the inverse. We artificially raise the rate. That's where the work is. If the central bank did nothing with government spending, the rates would actually always tend down to zero.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Right.
So, Alex,
by the act, is what I'm saying, by the act of a UBI, we're actually going to push the interest rates down to zero. That comes into play. What's beneficial about a UBI?
Well, it depends whether you assume whether you.
What's beneficial about a UBI is it gives people a means of income to either invest in a house or a new fridge. And so they don't have to go to the financial sector. And in that case, it reduces the financial sector's income share. And there is that benefit. I've modeled it. But we don't have to do anything with interest rates because all you're doing is you're hurting the people you're trying to help. You're not hurting the financial sector, right? You're imposing a cost on consumers,
who are the people you're trying to help?
And firms, right?
Who are the people
you're imposing an extra cost. Everybody has a mortgage, right? Interest rates add to inflation,
world, sure, right? In today's world,
everybody has a car payment, or everybody has credit card
it's
payments,
a
right?
symptom of something being wrong.
So if you increase that, though, you're adding an additional cost, and then you're trying to offset it with a UBI. I'm all for it, whatever your reason. But the whole idea of tighter monetary policy, that kind of just defeats what you're injecting financial assets through a UBI to certain people, but at the same time, cost with higher interest rates. I don't know if that's the right approach.
We have clashing theoretical frameworks here. I want to work out if that's the case or not. Are you proposing, Alex, that the interest rate changes itself cause the business cycle?
I'm proposing that excessively low interest rates cause an unstable expansion of private sector debt. Yes, and then that the unstable expansion of private sector debt leads to the business cycle because eventually it collapses. There's a credit cycle there.
Okay,
it's kind of a Minsky-ish view.
So it's a sort of Austrian version of Minsky, because Minsky actually argued you can't control the business cycle with interest rates. It's too blunt. It's the expectation.
Well, I would say that too. I just would say that you shouldn't keep interest rates low. I would say that you keep them high.
Yeah,
I think
in the sense that a very low.
But if you're here's the thing: if you're keeping them high, you're supporting the financial sector. Right? So you're giving a bigger share of the income to the financial sector by artificially increasing interest rates. Because remember, with government spending, the interbank rate, which dictates all the downstream rates in the economy, is being pushed down to zero.
So in the financial sector, everyone's a borrower and everyone's a lender, and they profit by picking up the spread. Yeah, essentially, on average, yeah. Even for ordinary people, most people are gross borrowers, gross debtors, and gross creditors, right? And I think if interest rates are lower, they pick up the spreads. If interest rates are higher, they pick up the spreads. Higher interest rates doesn't necessarily increase the spreads. Sometimes it decreases the spreads. Sometimes, and if money is tighter, then you can imagine that some of those spreads go away. Some of that financial activity stops, right? And that's when the financial sector people, the financial institutions, start making less profit, right? When money's easy, there's more finance happening. When money is tighter, there's less finance happening.
I think
I agree. It will change the amplitude of the business cycle. Go ahead,
Alex. The concept I've heard you talk about before, Alex, with regards to a ZERP policy, is that you end up with businesses that are basically ZERP businesses. Maybe we can explore that as a way of getting into this. Personally, by the way, this is something I disagree with you on, so I'm not trying to advocate for it. Just want to say, but that doesn't matter. I still want to explore this idea because it's interesting that if you have a low interest economy, then therefore that creates businesses that may otherwise not exist, and therefore that's unproductive. So maybe just explore that if you don't mind.
Well, I think easier credit conditions, lower interest rates allow more businesses to exist in general, right? So the question is, how far do you want to push that? If you're pushing more businesses to exist because you're trying to stimulate demand, right? If you're trying to kind of, I guess Keynes more emphasized fiscal policy, but if you're trying to do kind of Keynesian stimulus through the central bank, then are you really stimulating productive business, or are you just channeling money to consumers through wages, right? That's the issue. So, you hear people talk about zombie companies and, businesses that kind of stay afloat because they can get easy funding, especially during the 10 years of zero interest rates. And that is wasteful. That's wasteful that those businesses have to exist. And it went even longer in Japan, right? Where they had their QE long before, 2008. And it's, you don't have to do that. You don't have to kind of manipulate the financial sector to get money to people. You can just hand them money.
You're actually talking about trying to reduce the amount of money created by the credit system.
Yeah, and replacing that with money created by the government.
Okay, so if you look at looking at the American data, the average level of credit, it rose quite dramatically as a percentage of relative to GDP over a post-war period to the financial crisis. But the maximum level ever of credit as a percentage of, described as a percentage of GDP, was 15%. Okay. That was the maximum level of credit creation in any one year. That was in 2006. And then you had the crash, the crisis coming after. So you want to, I'm not a critic of eliminating a large part of private money creation. I see so much being done badly, and that private credit creation mainly is supporting asset bubbles rather than actual productive investment, and working capital and so on for corporations. So there's definitely a negative there. But I'm trying to get where you're coming from. So you're trying to eliminate the private sector's money creation activities, replaced with government money creation, where that is done for through a UBI.
I'm not trying to eliminate it entirely. I'm trying to eliminate it to the extent that we are using it for this, to try to solve this problem that UBI better solves, which is how to get money into the economy, into consumers' hands. Right. So if we are using credit creation for productive investment, that's fine. Right. But that's not how we talk about monetary policy. That's not how the central banks think about monetary policy. They think lowering interest rates will increase demand. Right. And it will. But we can increase demand without having to have lower interest rates. Right. In an ideal world where capital is being allocated efficiently, we would stimulate the financial sector for supply side reasons, not for demand side reasons.
Hold that thought, Alex. I'm just going to, before we're getting close to the top of the hour, I just want to plug Steve's Patreon, because if you're following these ideas and you want more of them, perhaps check out Steve Keen on Substack. A critical look at economists from a professor of economics. For more, go to patreon.com, Prof. Steve Keen, where most posts are free access, no paywall. And also Planksip, another one of our sponsors. As a philosophy and culture media outlet, Planksip helps emerging thought leaders with personal branding by co-creating organic content. But I think we probably, while you guys are thinking about other things you want to cover before we go, let's do the top chatters. And Alex, this one's on you now. So as fast as you like, head up our top chatters.
Here we go.
Sherry Wise, The Hasty Ent, Kevin Mays, Larry Summers, Michael De Souza Cruz, Ghost in the Half Shell, Douglas Dowell JD, Phil Waller, TR, Bill Sticker, Dr. Egg Eye, Tony Wilson, Julius, Garen Osborne, TSG, Ganymede 7, Reagan Boychuk, Phil S. Norwich Guitar, Web Freaks, No One, Charles O'Hare, Algorithm, Economics in One Lesson, Danger Zone, Nicholas Gomez, Turquoise Sound, Horatio 1886, Have a Date Tequila, Bob Dones, Lone Shark 88, The Herald of Change, Shot, Satya Sarma, Good Times, Kathleen Logan Smith, Andrew Sullivan, Lana Dell, Joe Polito, Paul Trainer, BSC, Recon Graves, James Hansen, The Talk Watcher, Thomas Darlington, Hoops Kavinsky.
Well done. Thank you very much.
Very
and
good.
also thank you very much to our chatters for there's been some very lively chat, isn't there? Has anyone seen
Extremely,
anything that
very weird.
yeah. I mean, more full,
And
they're
I-
always in there, but really full on this time. There's a lot of both ways going on. This is contentious.
Dave, can I just add just a real big thank you for Alex coming on into the Lion's Den today. It's been a great debate. I know you probably feel a bit outnumbered because you're outside of your comfort zone, but this has been a great episode. I personally admire anybody with progressive ideas that wants to help other human beings. At the end of the day, that's what matters to me. That's the good I see in other human beings. So even if we have our little theoretical debates, huge respect towards you.
Yeah, I'm rooting for you, Alex, because I mean, there's things that I'm thinking, why do I disagree with that? And then I have to go and think about it. It's really good for me to think about it. I mean, on the macro stuff, I've a lot of things that I've followed, I understand from an MMT point of view, and so of course there's some that clashes with that. Who's right? I don't know. I'm trying to find out. Steve's explained it to my thinking clearly, and I have to go with the experts. I can't prove this stuff. So that's where I stand with it. But what I think you bring to me is a much clearer thinking about we're taking the passion out of UBI and looking at the mechanics of it in more detail and why it should be in the economy in the first place. And I think that's interesting. Sorry, Mike or Steve, thoughts?
Oh, well, just it does clarify some of the conflict that I've got with the job guarantee versus people in the States versus universal basic income. I mean, and like again, coming back to Ty's point, I want to see more cooperation amongst people with progressive ideas rather than the level of conflict that I see, and that's that is, you know, I've got a bit of handle somewhere that conflict does come from. But certainly, you've used the word calibrate extensively, Alex. I think if you're going to take the approach of taking a UBI, then you've got to get into the modeling to start doing that. Because other calibration is waffle if you don't actually say, well, what are you trying to calibrate? What would be the impact of this in a cyclical system? Yeah, I want to see some numbers, basically.
Yeah, there's so many competing ideas sort of in the same sandbox, from a negative income tax to a job guarantee to a UBI to a employer of last resort program, and they're all, the heart is more or less in the same place, the spirit of them more or less in the same place, but then the devil's in the details, and what are the implications both long and short run need to be sorted, right? And once it's understood, then the case can be made to the people that we should really think about redesigning our social airplane this way.
Well, I would love to do modeling. I don't know if I have it in me, but I hope maybe when my kids grow up, maybe in 20 years, I'll do some modeling. Yeah.
Yeah, the little ones, they can keep you busy.
Yeah. So yeah, this was great. I didn't feel outnumbered. You know, if I was only friends with people who agreed with me, I wouldn't have any friends. So I think I count myself among Steve Keen and friends. I think that's fine. And this was a great discussion. I hope to continue the discussion with anyone here, anyone in the chat. If you go, so my organization is called the Gresham Institute, and it's gresham.org, GRESHM. There's no A. If you go to the bottom, there's a little icon for Discord, and you can come argue with us there if you want. We'll be on right now. Me and two of my colleagues will be on there.
It's linked. It's linked in the description.
Linked in the description.
Linked in the description.
Oh, good. Okay, I'll take a look. Thank you.
Well, we are just about done. But what's a good takeaway from this? Is it a question of, like Mike said, the spirit behind all these things is the thing I always come back to. So what I'm taking away is the most frustrating thing, I think, is getting into endless debates with people who are broadly trying to do the same things, and what it comes down to is there's not enough modeling done, I think, and this is somebody who doesn't do modeling, obviously, is not my world. There's not enough modeling done to go, here's what happens when you pull those levers, and where we can really look at it. It is all models in people's heads and models to do with how they feel individually, what they would do, which is the problem. So I'm all for seeing more models, people talk about how these things actually work when they're in the world, and taking the heat out of things. So Alex, I really appreciate you coming on and putting these ideas forward.
Yeah, I just want to say one more thing, which is that there's a lot of disagreement about this kind of stuff, and everybody wants to live in a more prosperous world. We want people to be better off, and we disagree about how to do that. And if we follow an idea that's wrong, people are going to die, right? So we're all on the same team. We all want the same thing, but we all think everybody else is going to cause death, right, or suffering or something like that. So it's really hard to have conversations without kind of getting heated.
It's true. It's true.
No.
But if we can get one day, we'll have perfect models, and we'll know exactly what to do. Maybe one day, but that's for tomorrow. For today and for right now, everybody, take care. Be nice. Look after yourselves. Remember to brush your teeth. Visit your mum. Hit the subscribe and the bell so you know when we're going live next week. But for now, it's goodbye from Steve Keen and friends, and thank you, Alex Howlett. Take care.
Okay. Yep.